She has not been sentenced yet. But what she told us was consistent, obviously, with what our handwriting expert had already concluded. And then, in April of 2021, Jake Wagner came forward as well. He will be here to testify for you, and he will tell you, I guess I should back up before I go into what he told us. A proffer means you're giving us a statement and telling us what happened, and in exchange, we give you something in return. The state gives you something. What we agreed to give him was to dismiss the death penalty against him, right? You will learn that he pled to all of the counts in the indictment, all of the specifications, and he received he will receive under that agreement, 8 life without parole sentences consecutive to one another, which just means they're served one after another, which is fiction, legal fiction at that point. But in addition to hundreds of years, with 78 years being mandatory firearm specifications that he has to serve before he even ever gets to his life without parole. I think at one point the judge said to him, "You understand that you will die in prison?" And he said yes. So he understands that. The second part of the agreement, he wanted us to also dismiss the specification against his family, each of his family members. He wanted them to escape the death penalty. And we told him we would not do that unless he agreed to testify in their trials. So if any one of them went to trial, okay? So just so you know what the deal was. He actually, kind of unlike a lot of defendants, seemed to be doing this to benefit his family, at least as much as himself, if not more. So that said, we sat down with him and he told us what had happened. And I will say that we were right about the majority of it. The majority of it being that, he dated Hannah, he fell in love with her, he was very upset when they parted ways. He wanted her very much to come back to him. He, was certainly jealous. But also that the idea to kill these people did not initiate with him. He was definitely a willing participant. He will tell you that his dad was the first to broach the subject with him. And under the idea that Hannah Mae was dating people that they didn't approve of, and that she was letting Sophia be around people that were not good people. And they knew that Hannah, or they believed that Hannah, had been sexually abused by one of a friend of the family, kind of peer age friend of the family, and nobody did anything about that, so they, this concern was laid out as well, that, if anything would happen, nobody would protect Sophia over there. And the idea was that they had to kill Hannah. And Jake said, no, I'm not going to do that, when his dad first brought the idea to him. However, on another occasion, Jake will tell you that he thought about it, and although he did not believe anything had happened to Sophia at the time of the homicides, he indicated to us that, why would you wait for something to happen? Because you can't undo that. So based on that, and encouraged by his father and encouraged by his mother, they set out on a plan to kill Hannah Mae. At first, it was just going to be Hannah Mae. There was an idea to kill Hannah Mae and kill Corey Holdren and make it look like Corey killed Hannah Mae and then killed himself. Billy didn't think that would fly or work out. I believe Angela Wagner at one point suggested that they just rat Chris Sr. out because they knew he had marijuana, and that maybe if he went to prison that would upset things enough, and Billy said he wouldn't do that to his best friend. But ultimately, this idea snowballed, and it became, we have to kill Hannah Mae, Frankie, little Chris, and big Chris. And then, like I said, on site, that Kenneth got added on to that, or after they had already agreed to their main targets. And again, Jake will tell you freely that they knew there might be other people there, and they knew that they would kill them, even though they were perfectly innocent. He will tell you that they started making plans for this thing in January, which was, a month after they had read that comment by Hannah Mae that they will have to kill me first. He understood that he would probably not end up with custody if he went the legal route. His attorney had told him that in Ohio, because you weren't married, the law favors the mother, that you're not likely to get full custody. And he believed that. He also believed what he had read, that Hannah Mae would never sign custody papers over to him. So he believed the only way to get sole control of his daughter was to kill Hannah Mae and her family members. He will admit that he purchased the silencer parts, that they purchased a truck specifically for this, to commit this offense in. He will admit that Angela Wagner bought the shoes for he and George to wear the night of the homicides, again, trying to make it different sizes than what they normally wore, and to make it a different kind of shoe than they would be caught dead in, frankly. They usually wore boots and usually did not wear tennis shoes, especially that kind of make and style. So he admits that. And the same idea was for the murder truck, the truck that they used for the murder. You will hear that Billy overheard his cousin saying, or his uncle saying, that he was selling a car. He was talking to Silas Wagner is his name. He was talking to another individual and said that he would sell this truck that he had for $2,500, and Billy said, "We'll buy it." And that was one day, and then shortly thereafter, Silas will tell you that Jake and George and Angela came up to his property and gave him the $2,500 for that truck. Jake will tell you that they modified the truck. They built a false bed in the truck. Jake will tell you he used 2x4s. You'll have pictures of the truck, but where the eye hooks were, there's a level plane, and then there's some eye hooks kind of on top of that. He put the 2x4s up, and then put plywood, and then put hay on top of that, so it would look like the bed was full of hay. And instead, that's where he and George stowed away when they drove up to Chris Sr.'s that night, with their weapons and everything they needed for that night. He would tell you what they wore. They wore ski masks. They wore dark clothing. There was some concern that Brentley might recognize Jake because he had seen Jake on many occasions, and Sophia had always been able to recognize Jake even when he was in costume. He will tell you that they made plans with Chris Sr. Billy made plans with Chris Sr. about this imaginary drug deal. And so he was going to drive up to talk to Chris Sr. about that drug deal that night. And still don't know if it's a real thing or not, or if this was all just a feigned way for him to go up there. But that way Chris Sr. would be expecting them, right? So no alarms would be sounded. They went up there around 10:30 p.m., first meeting at their house at 260 Peterson. Billy had come to Peterson driving his red dually They had signed the custody documents that we had found. His mom had, Googled that and printed it and filled it out, and they just signed their name to it. He will acknowledge that they watched the Boondock Saints video clip before they left that night. He and George, anyhow, he remembers. And that when it was time to go, they walked out into the barn where the truck was that they had modified. They purposely kept it out of sight of the neighbors and stuff by parking it back behind that new barn, and changed their clothes out there. They didn't want to leave any shoe prints of those brand new Walmart shoes anywhere on their property until they were ready to get into the truck. And they got into the bed of the truck, and Billy drove the truck up to see his friend. And they remained in the back of that bed of the truck until such time as Billy came out and lowered the gate for them, at which point they slithered, I think was the word he used, out of the truck, and got underneath that truck, and George got under that truck, and Jake got under Chris Sr.'s truck, which is, they had parked their vehicle right by one of Chris Sr.'s trucks. George had the SKS at that time. Again, that was his gun. Jake didn't really even like the gun. And George, the plan was that George was going to shoot Chris Sr. from a distance, like a sniper, in a fashion that Chris would never know what hit him, would never know that Billy Wagner was betraying him or whatever. Of course, Gary was there also. They went out to an outdoor grow. They walked back in front of the house, and I should probably do one up there.
Judge, can we reposition ourselves to see the...
Yes, certainly, yeah.
Where are you going to put it?
I'm just going to hold it. So, at the point that Chris and Gary were walking back this way, Billy leading them single file, that's when George was supposed to shoot Chris at that point. Again, just so, and this is when you guys saw it, the trailer wasn't there, but this structure was there, and this is the garage, and then again, this is the path leading over towards Frankie's. You guys see that? But when he was basically walking in front of the trailer is when they were supposed to shoot him, so that he would not know. That's State's Exhibit A544. Jake will tell you, however, that George was taking too long and seemed to be frozen. He didn't know if it was because I neglected to tell you this. So that thing that we dug out of the well, the silencer that we dug out of the well, had all the parts that they had purchased to make the silencer. That was a prototype, but it had failed, right? And so they scrapped that idea, and they decided to use filters instead, fuel filters instead. So they had a silencer made out of a filter on both the SKS and the 1911. So the 40 Glock was the only weapon that did not have a silencer on it. So Matt White was right about all of the involved weapons. It was a 40 Glock, it was a 1911 22, and it was a high-powered 30 caliber SKS. So Jake didn't know if it was because the fuel filter was blocking his view, because Jake said when he had test fired the weapon, he found that to be an issue. Either way, ultimately, Jake took the weapon from George, and Billy at some point came back out to where they were and were questioning them why they hadn't shot. And at that time, Billy came up with a ruse of asking Chris Sr. to call his phone. I don't know where my phone is. Can you call it so I can find my phone? Well, truth be told, all the phones belonging to Billy and Jake and George were left back at Peterson Road, actually with instructions to Angela, who remained back at the home with Bullvine and Sophia, to text people or use the phone so it would appear that they were at home this whole time, providing them an alibi. Of note, the phone jammer had worked when they tested it, but the battery ran out very quickly, Jake will tell you, and so it didn't work for long at all. And so you will see, I told you that 10:55 p.m. Time was very important. It's very important because that's when Chris Sr., at the request of his friend Billy Wagner, made calls to his friend's phone so that his friend could find his phone. And really all that did was take him to the front door so that Jake could shoot him. And so we kind of know the time of death of Chris Sr. because it was shortly after making that phone call. He was standing in the doorway. That's why we have that SKS high-powered rifle that is shooting through the doorway and forcing the wood into his skin. Again, you will see that it broke his arm. And Billy was still inside of the residence, according to Jake, with the .40 Glock, where he shot both Billy or Chris and Gary. And they had multiple gunshot. I think Chris Sr. had 9 total gunshot wounds. Gary, I believe, had 5. I'm going to be wrong on that. Maybe 3. But they were shot Gary was shot entirely in the head. You will see that his glasses and his ball cap flew off. The projectile actually took that off of his head. And he will say at that point, Billy came running out of the residence and was hysterical, saying, "I just shot my best friend. I just shot my best friend." And it talks about the look that Chris gave him when he realized what was happening. Jake will tell you that he and George tried to calm Billy down, and that Jake went inside the residence and retrieved keys that he knew to be in Chris Sr.'s pocket to go to the grow that was in that here, where the cameras were, so that he could remove the cameras. It's there. While he did that, George and Billy drug the bodies of Gary Roden and Chris Sr. back to the bedroom of Chris Sr. Jake knows that because when he came back down, their bodies had been moved. And they then, I'm trying to think if they did anything else then. They then went down to check Frankie's residence. They found that it was locked. That was kind of a recent occurrence because when Brentley is there, he has a tendency to escape out the front door. And so they installed the chain lock and the lock. And they decided that they would return to that location later. So they went back to Chris Sr.'s, and the idea became that we would get into Chris Sr.'s truck and travel to Dana's house. The idea being, if you arrive in Chris Sr.'s truck, no one's going to be alarmed when you pull in the driveway at that hour of night, right? But they drove by Dana's, and Dana was not yet there. And I think I told you earlier that they claimed that she was not a main target, yet they didn't take that opportunity to enter the residence and kill Hannah Mae and little Chris, whom they were determined to kill. They went back. They said at that time they drove down to Left Fork to see what the status was at Kenneth's residence. They just drove by the residence at that time. And this is why we took you on this wild goose chase on the jury view. We were literally taking you the path that they took that night, including the walking to Frankie's first and then, walking back. Once back at Chris Sr.'s, they then decided to go to Frankie's. Jake will tell you that he entered through there was an open window at the back of the trailer. Again, keep in mind that this is a trailer that he has been in before. And he went then to the back door, and he will tell you first he tried to pry open the back door with a knife, and he claims that it broke the tip off and didn't open up he couldn't get the door to open, so that's why he entered into the window. But then he went there and opened up the back door so that George and Billy could enter the Frankie and Hazel's. Then he went back. He will tell you that Brentley was asleep on that couch upon entering the residence. There was a couch in the living room, and the TV was on. And he went back to the room where he knew Hannah, Hazel, and Frankie would be sleeping, and shot both of them with the 1911 .22. He will tell you that he looked around for their phones but couldn't find them. And that was another thing I forgot to mention, is that he did take the phones of Chris Sr. So all we had were the phone records, which told us the tolls, not content. And they left that residence. They went back to Chris Sr.'s again and got into the vehicle, to Chris Sr.'s vehicle, and they went to Dana's. There, they entered that residence. Jake will tell you that both George and Billy entered the residence. Billy with the .40, George with the SKS. They didn't know, again, they thought maybe Chris would have a friend over. They thought maybe Corey Holdren would be there, so they needed to make sure that nothing went awry. And so George was spaced, and Jake will show you exactly where in that scene that he was planted. The interesting thing is that he indicated that he wore the size 10.5 that night, and that George wore the size 11 that night. And you will see that size 11 that I told you that was in scene 3 at Dana's place is almost exactly where he says that George was stationed, to make sure that little Chris didn't come out of his room with a weapon while he was off killing the women in the trailer. He will tell you that he went into a hallway, and again, we will show you this with crime scene photos, etc. But he basically positioned himself so that he could see both Hannah and Dana. He could tell that Dana was on her phone because it was kind of lighting up her face. He will tell you that she made a noise, that he said he kind of froze initially, but she made a noise which jolted her out of it. And Kylie started crying. And he says he took 2 quick steps into Dana's room and shot her twice, and then immediately rushed back to where Hannah was And he will tell you that Hannah obviously heard him because she was laying with her left side to the doorway and turned to look. She had been nursing Kylie and saw him. He doesn't believe she recognized him, but she saw him and he shot her. He will tell you that after he shot her, he rearranged her body on the bed so that Kylie could nurse if she wanted to. And he will say that he went back into Dana's room and shot her more times because she was making noises. And then he will tell you that he went out of the door that led from Dana's room into the kitchen. And when he opened the door, his dad was standing there with the .40 drawn, probably in a just-in-case, situation. And George was still behind his father, guarding little Chris's room. He will tell you that Jake claims that he then went to little Chris's room and also shot little Chris, who had never woken up. He was asleep at the time he was killed. Again, he removed all the phones. He will tell you that although that sounds like a very long time, it actually happened all very quickly. They then went back and got into Chris's car. This time they drove back to Chris's car and got their truck that they had brought up there, the one that they had purchased from Silas Wagner. And the cars followed each other. So at that point, Billy was driving the truck that they had, Chris's truck, and George was driving the truck that they had purchased. And they went down to Left Fork, and again, you'll see this on the surveillance cameras. And Jake will say that there was a little turnoff that we kind of showed you, a little intersection down there close to Left Fork, that's where they had George pull off. He was kind of a lookout / getaway driver in the event that things went bad. Again, they were driving Chris's truck right up to Kenneth's driveway. Kenneth had an electric sensor. His daughter will tell you that if he had taken his blood pressure medication, he's a very heavy sleeper. And that's the only thing she can guess as to why he didn't wake up. But his door is unlocked when he's sleeping inside of it because he padlocks it when he leaves it. So the padlock's on the outside, not on the inside. And Jake states that Billy entered that residence and he claims he saw a flash of light and that Billy killed him with the .40 caliber Glock. At that point, there again was cameras to remove at that location because he had a kind of a mini grow, and they did that and removed a trail cam from a tree as well. Jake confirms to us, like I said, that both he and George dyed their hair that week. Again, he stated that he wanted to look like Norman Reedus. He states that George helped modify the truck, that George signed the custody documents just like he did, and that George rode in the back of the truck with him up there and helped move Chris and Gary's bodies. And like I said, that he would have shot little Chris if he came out of the room and that he was wearing the size 11 shoe that night. After they were done at Kenneth's, they drove back up to Chris Sr.'s. They left Chris Sr.'s truck there and got in the vehicle that they had purchased from Silas Wagner and drove back to Peterson Road, where they kind of just undid everything they did, right? They parked the truck in the barn. They got out of those clothes. They put on their original clothing. And Jake will say that they burned and tried to destroy the weapons cut up the weapons and destroy specifically the firing pins and other things that would enable BCI or anybody to do ballistics on them. And that they dug a hole in the barn and buried put it in a duffel bag and buried it temporarily. He will tell you that in the meantime, once they also disassembled the truck, the fake false bed in the truck, and that Billy then took the truck to his niece, Billy's niece, Katie Wagner. Katie Wagner is the daughter of Billy's brother, Bobby. They live in Athens, and you will hear from them as well that kind of out of the blue, Billy Wagner shows up with a truck for Katie. Before the sun had even risen, unannounced, unplanned, unpredicted. And of course, Katie was not going to look a gift horse in the mouth. She was happy to have a truck, and she got it titled in her name the same day. And you will see that it was titled in her name on April 22nd of 2016. Billy had Bobby taken back to the farm, and because he didn't have any other way to get back, and Bobby will tell you that when he arrived, both Jake and George were outside of the house, and they led him into the old barn, not the new barn where they had been doing their dirty deeds, but the new barn, and had him look at a pig or something. And ultimately, he said he went into the residence with the three of them, Jake, George, and Billy. Jake will tell you that obviously they planned this for months, and their plan was not only to kill these people, but also to get away with it. They didn't want to get caught. So they took great measures to do that. One of those great measures was to not talk on phones, not even talk in the house unless you ran water nearby. They would go outside and talk. They just pretty much assumed that everything was bugged. And once they firmly believed that they were being listened to, they started to throw their conversation, accordingly. And you can very much see that in the recorded conversations that we have. He also tells us what he did with the murder weapons. That was something that we were told before we even sat down and talked with him, because as you might imagine, we were a little bit leery, but we were told that he would lead us to the murder weapons. So he did. He told us that after the homicides and after they had buried those items and burned a lot of the items as well, that anything that was left over, they had 5-gallon buckets of concrete, and they dropped the stuff in 4 different buckets of concrete. And then they made a goose box for their grandfather, Robert Wagner, the father, Bobby Wagner, not the brother. And they gave it to him for Father's Day that year, and floated it on the pond, that big pond that you saw out there, and used the concrete buckets full of the murder weapons as anchors. You'll hear they fished out there all the time. So that obviously was something that they could see every day. And you were directed to the part of the pond where it was. It was that back right corner, and we had you even walk up on that embankment and drew your attention to the structure that was there. That was the goose box. It ultimately sank. But armed with this information, we were able to get a search warrant and go out there, and we did recover those concrete buckets and took them to the lab at BCI, where they were broken up, chiseled out, soaked in oil, and recovered multiple weapon parts belonging to an SKS, the 1911, the 40 Glock. Even though they were in parts, the firing pin had not been damaged, So Matt White, who is our ballistics expert, will tell you that he was able to test fire those. They have the ability in the lab to hold the gun together so it doesn't explode apart. And he was able to make positive identifications with the ballistics on both the 22 and the 40 Glock. So we know without a doubt that those were the murder weapons that were used that Jake led us to. On the bottom of the pond at the Flying W. They were all there when they put that goose box in there. Jake, George, Billy, Angela. After that, we, being the skeptic of the pirate, right? We made an offer to the rest of the individuals that if anyone came forward, we purposely did not release Jake's statement. We did not provide that to anybody. Nobody except the attorneys and our lead agent knew the contents of that proffer. And we said that if anyone else came forward and could tell us something that was consistent with what we had just heard, that would do two things for us. It would demonstrate that Jake was telling us the truth, right? And it would just be stronger corroborating evidence that another member of the Wagner family was giving us the same information without knowing exactly what Jake had said, right? And that person that came forward was Angela Wagner. She came forward in September of 2021, about 5 months after Jake had come forward. Her deal was a little better, a lot better, actually. She agreed to a 30-year sentence. Obviously, she's older. She will be almost 80 when she gets out under that deal. It's still a really hard pill to swallow because she freely admits, quite honestly, you could tell that Jake tried to minimize his mom's involvement, kind of also tried to minimize George's involvement to some extent, but Angela did not. Angela did not minimize her own involvement. In fact, she will tell you that it was her idea to begin with, and that she nagged and nagged and nagged Billy to figure out a solution to the problem. The problem being that we're losing control of Sophia, right? She's over here and we don't know what's going on with her. Keep an eye on her when she's over there. When you go up to Chris's, keep an eye on her and make sure she's okay. I think Billy reported that Frankie was too affectionate, according to Angela. Of course, now again, this contradicts what Jake said, which was that nothing had happened, and this was basically a preemptive killing. But she admits that she was very concerned about Sophia. They all were. And that they would do anything to protect Sophia, and that she told her husband that she was concerned, and that's where the ideas were born. She admits that she bought the phone jammer knowing that it was going to be used to jam the phones on that night so that they could not call for help. She admits that she bought the bug detector, which was to detect any bugging devices that the investigation team might use after the fact. And she admits to buying the shoes for her sons, which of course she had already admitted to at the border. She admits to Googling and printing out those custody documents, to forging Hannah Mae's name to those documents, to also forging her mother's notary signature. She admits that on that night that she was told to work with the phones so that it would appear that both Jake and George were still at the residence and using their phones. She will tell you that they all three left the house that night, and they all three came back in with different shirts on than what they had left with. She will tell you that when they went to buy the truck from Silas Wagner, that it was George that got the money from the safe in order to purchase that truck, although she did say that George advised that he didn't think it was smart to buy it off of a family member because it could be traced back to them. She will tell you that after the fact, that she confided in her husband, Billy, that she felt guilty for dragging Jake and George into this because they should have just taken it on themselves because that was a lot to put on Jake and George. And she had noticed that George was having nightmares, and she's telling Billy this. And Billy's response was, I don't know why he would have nightmares. He didn't shoot anybody. So again, she will also tell you that at one point she was very upset when we interviewed her at the border, and she didn't have a good story for the shoes, and she just admitted that she bought it for the boys and then said she threw them away the same day, and she knew that was not a very believable story, and she was very worried that she had ruined it for them. And George made the comment that he had tried to wipe off the shoe prints that were left at the scene at Chris Sr.'s. She will tell you that George helped to build the goose box, they were plans that Billy brought down to them, but that Jake and George built it in the driveway. She admits to the Facebook hacking and said that she did it to benefit George, but that they just inadvertently saw this messaging back and forth. She indicates that she had a conversation with George in the kitchen. A lot of conversations in this family happen in the kitchen. That's where they have a lot of their family meetings. And checked in with him to make sure he was okay with the plan. She will state that everyone was, quote, reluctant, but understood that they needed to do this in order to protect Sophia, and everybody, including George, would do anything to protect Sophia. She had admitted that she initially said that we should just rat Chris Sr. out and that they were not willing to do that. She also admitted to threatening to get a gun when Tabitha was fleeing the residence and to throw in a 2x4 at Tabitha. So we kind of asked her about some of those kinds of things as well. Both Jake and Angela admitted a lot of other stuff as well, some other crimes, but we'll cover that when I'm reviewing the criminal charges with you, because there's actually a charge that they are charged with in this indictment as functioning as a criminal enterprise. So we'll talk about that. She acknowledged that they have family meetings and take votes, and that each one of them would do anything to protect the children. And again, we talked about it during voir dire that you want to corroborate the pirates, right? You want to corroborate